Hello everyone, I am the Boring Historian and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The medieval period, stretching roughly from the 5th to the 15th century, represents a complex and multifaceted era in human sexual history. Far from the simplistic characterizations often portrayed in popular culture, either as an age of prudish repression or unbridled debauchery, medieval sexuality existed within a nuanced framework of religious doctrine, social hierarchy, practical necessity, and human desire. This narrative explores the realities of sexual life during the Middle Ages, examining how different social classes experienced intimacy, how religious institutions attempted to regulate sexual behavior, and how the lived experiences of medieval people often diverged from the ideological constraints imposed upon them. To understand medieval sexuality, we must first dispel the notion of a monolithic medieval experience. The period encompassed 1,000 years of human history across diverse regions, with significant variations in customs, practices, and attitudes. What constituted acceptable sexual behavior for a 12th century French noblewoman differed markedly from the experiences of a 9th century English peasant or a 14th century Italian merchant. Yet certain common threads ran through medieval European society, particularly the omnipresent influence of the Catholic Church, which sought to extend its authority into the most intimate aspects of people's lives. As we embark on this exploration of medieval sexuality, we will encounter a world both alien and familiar, one where the fundamental human desires remained constant, but the social, religious, and cultural frameworks for understanding and regulating those desires differed profoundly from our own. The medieval understanding of sexuality was fundamentally shaped by the Catholic Church, which developed an extensive theological framework for categorizing, judging, and regulating sexual behavior. Building upon the writings of church fathers like Augustine and Jerome, medieval theologians articulated a vision of sexuality that was deeply skeptical of carnal pleasure. St. Jerome's famous declaration that a man who is too passionately in love with his wife is an adulterer encapsulated the Church's ambivalent attitude toward marital sex. While acknowledging the necessity of sexual intercourse for procreation, Church authorities condemned sexual pleasure as a potentially sinful distraction from spiritual matters. Thomas Aquinas, one of the most influential theologians of the medieval period, went so far as to suggest that a man who slept with his wife solely for pleasure was treating her like a prostitute. The Church's sexual theology drew heavily on the biblical story of Adam and Eve. According to the prevailing interpretation, Eve's role in the fall established women as potential seductresses, inherently more prone to sexual temptation and more likely to lead men astray. This interpretation had profound consequences for gender relations throughout the medieval period, contributing to widespread misogyny and suspicion of female sexuality. Central to the Church's teaching was the idea that sexual activity should be confined to marriage and directed solely toward procreation. All sexual acts that could not result in conception, including masturbation, oral and anal sex, and homosexual relations, were condemned as unnatural and therefore sinful. Even within marriage, sexual activity was hedged about with numerous restrictions and prohibitions. For married couples, the Church provided detailed guidelines governing when, how, and why they could engage in sexual intercourse. According to the Summae Confessorum, a 13th century handbook for confessors, married couples were forbidden from having sex on numerous occasions, including feast days, fast days, Sundays, during the woman's menstrual period, during pregnancy while the woman was breastfeeding, and for 40 days after childbirth. By some estimates, these restrictions meant that the average married couple could legally have sexual relations less than once per week. Boccaccio's Decameron satirizes these restrictions through the character of Messer Ricciardo di Kinzica, who uses religious prohibitions to limit sexual contact with his young wife. For he made it clear to her that there was not a single day that was not the feast of one or more saints, out of respect for whom man and woman should abstain from sexual union. To the foregoing he added holidays of obligation, the 4 Ember Weeks, the Eves of the Apostles, and a numerous array of subsidiary saints, Fridays and Saturdays, the Sabbath, the whole of Lent, certain phases of the moon, and various special occasions. For a long time, much to the chagrin of his lady, whose turn came round once a month at the most, he abided by this regime. Beyond restricting when couples could have sex, the Church also provided guidance on appropriate sexual positions. The only sanctioned position was what later came to be known as the missionary position, with the man on top and the woman beneath him. This position was favored because it maintained the proper gender hierarchy, with the man in the dominant position, and was believed to offer the best chance of conception. Other positions, particularly those in which the woman assumed a dominant role, were considered sinful or unnatural. The treatise De Secretis Mulierum, on the secrets of women, offered detailed instructions for marital coitus, advising physical preparation, such as emptying the bowels and bladder, and sufficient foreplay to raise the female's body heat to the correct temperature. The husband was advised to make his move when his wife began to speak as if she were babbling, an early reference to sexual arousal. The Church's ability to regulate sexual behavior was significantly enhanced by the sacrament of confession. The Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 mandated annual confession for all Christians, creating a system of spiritual surveillance that extended into the bedroom. Through confession, priests gained intimate knowledge of parishioners' sexual transgressions and could assign appropriate penances. Penitential manuals, handbooks that helped priests assign appropriate penances for various sins, devoted considerable attention to sexual offenses. These manuals categorized sexual sins according to their perceived gravity, with sins against nature, those that could not result in conception, generally receiving the harshest penances. The practice of confession created a complex dynamic wherein medieval people internalized the Church's sexual norms, even as they frequently transgressed them. The very existence of detailed prohibitions and penances for various sexual practices suggests that such practices were common enough to warrant attention. As one scholar from the National Museum of Switzerland notes, in the end, it is clear-cut. The very existence of criticism and explicit rules provides a clear indication of real-life practice. What would be their purpose otherwise? Despite the apparent rigidity of the Church's sexual theology, attitudes did evolve over the course of the medieval period. By the 13th and 14th centuries, some theologians began adopting more nuanced positions regarding marital sexuality. Albert the Great, for example, excused sexual intercourse during pregnancy, claiming that a woman never desires sex so much as she does when she is pregnant. Medicine is most needed in the time of greatest illness. This gradual softening of attitudes toward marital sex reflected the Church's pragmatic recognition that complete sexual abstinence was unrealistic for most married couples. It also reflected the growing influence of Aristotelian philosophy, which took a more positive view of the natural world, including human sexuality. Nevertheless, the fundamental tenets of medieval sexual theology remained largely unchanged throughout the period. Sex was for procreation, not pleasure. It belonged exclusively within marriage, and it remained subject to extensive ecclesiastical regulation and scrutiny. In medieval society, marriage functioned primarily as a social and economic institution rather than a romantic one. Particularly among the nobility and wealthy merchants, marriages were arranged to forge alliances between families, consolidate property, or advance social position. As one historian succinctly puts it, people, especially aristocrats but other families too, were generally looking for advantageous marriages for their children with a nice fat dowry or inheritance of land. Marriageable daughters were a valuable commodity in medieval England. The economic dimension of marriage was formalized through the institution of the dowry, property or money that the bride's family provided to the groom upon marriage. The dowry was traditionally given or promised publicly at the wedding ceremony, emphasizing the contractual nature of the marriage alliance. For aristocratic families, the dowry might include substantial lands or property, while for peasant families, it might consist of household goods, livestock, or a small sum of money. Despite the emphasis on marriage as an economic transaction, medieval law and theology insisted that marriage required the consent of both parties. The principle of mutual consent, established in church law by the 12th century, held that a valid marriage required the free agreement of both bride and groom. This principle existed in tension with the reality of arranged marriages, particularly for young aristocratic women who faced immense familial and social pressure to accept proposed matches. For the peasantry, marriage practices differed significantly from those of the nobility. Peasant marriages were less likely to be arranged for strategic advantage and more likely to reflect personal choice or practical considerations. As one source notes, only among the lower classes did people marry consistently for reasons of love or sexual desire. In general, however, peasant marriages were not common, as there was little need for a formal exchange of property among the poor. Peasants typically married later than nobles, often in their 20s rather than their teens. This delay reflected economic realities. It took time to accumulate sufficient resources to establish an independent household. Peasant marriages also required the payment of various fees, including the merchet, a fine paid to the lord when a female serf married and left the manor. Villeins, the lowest-ranking peasants, required their lord's permission to marry at all. The medieval wedding ceremony combined religious elements with public celebrations that reinforced the social and economic dimensions of marriage. By the 13th century, church law required that marriages be publicly announced in advance, the reading of the banns, to prevent clandestine marriages and give people an opportunity to raise any impediments to the union. The wedding ceremony itself was remarkably brief by modern standards. According to one description, the actual church bit of a wedding was usually remarkably brief and would have seemed relatively unimportant to a modern observer. You didn't even go into church as a rule. The priest came out and blessed the marriage on the steps of the church. Generally at this point, the groom would give a gift called a wed to the bride. This showed that he was consenting to be married, and if she accepted the gift, that showed her consent. This was a vital part of a medieval marriage, which despite any societal or family pressure, had to be seen to be between two consenting adults. The wed was sometimes a brooch, but most commonly a ring. Following the church ceremony, a wedding feast would typically be held, featuring food, music, and dancing. The celebration served multiple purposes. It marked the creation of a new household, cemented alliances between families, and provided public acknowledgement of the couple's new status. For many medieval theologians and canon lawyers, the marriage was not fully valid until it had been consummated through sexual intercourse. This emphasis on consummation reflected the view that procreation was the primary purpose of marriage. According to Gratian, an influential 12th century canonist, a valid marriage required both spiritual consent and physical consummation. The importance of consummation is illustrated in Boccaccio's tale of Sophronia, who weds Giuseppus but consummates the marriage with his friend Titus, who thereby becomes her real husband. Although set in ancient Greece rather than medieval Italy, the story reflects the common view that physical consummation was crucial to establishing a valid marital bond. Some theologians went further, arguing that the ability to engage in sexual intercourse was a prerequisite for marriage. Thomas Aquinas and Bonaventure both maintained that a man with a permanent inability to copulate could not contract a valid marriage, while Bernard of Montemurro specifically identified the ability to inseminate as crucial to marriage validity. These positions reflected the centrality of procreation to the medieval understanding of marriage. Within marriage, sexual relations were governed by complex expectations that balanced procreative necessity against spiritual ideals of restraint. The Church presented marriage as a concession to human weakness, a legitimate outlet for sexual desire that prevented the greater sin of fornication. As Augustine famously argued, marital sex was permissible but not praiseworthy. It represented a lesser evil rather than a positive good. This ambivalent attitude toward marital sexuality created a tension that shaped the experiences of medieval couples. On one hand, spouses had a mutual obligation to engage in sexual relations, what canon lawyers called the marital debt. Either spouse could request sexual intercourse, and the other was obligated to comply, barring legitimate reasons for refusal, such as illness or religious prohibitions on specific days. On the other hand, spouses were admonished not to desire each other too ardently, or to prioritize pleasure over procreation. As Thomas Aquinas warned, a man who approached his wife with excessive desire was guilty of the sin of sexual excess, even within marriage. William of Padua adopted a slightly more lenient position, suggesting that it was not sinful to marry for sexual attraction, provided this was not the primary motivation. For many medieval couples, these theological distinctions may have seemed remote from the realities of married life. Evidence from literature, court records, and medical texts suggests that medieval people, like their modern counterparts, sought physical pleasure and emotional intimacy in their marital relationships. The tension between theological ideals and lived experience created a space in which individuals negotiated their own understandings of marital sexuality, sometimes conforming to church teaching and sometimes diverging from it. For the medieval nobility, sexuality was intimately bound up with considerations of lineage, property, and political alliance. Marriages among the aristocracy were arranged primarily to consolidate wealth, forge political connections, or secure advantageous inheritance patterns. As a result, sexual compatibility and romantic attraction rarely factored into the selection of marriage partners. Given these pragmatic foundations, it is perhaps unsurprising that extramarital affairs were relatively common among the nobility. The cultural phenomenon of courtly love, celebrated in medieval literature and song, often centered on adulterous relationships. As one historian notes, probably the most famous example in literature is the love between Guinevere, the wife of King Arthur, and Lancelot, Arthur's most famous knight. Medieval storytellers loved to tell not only of the excitement of romance, but also the tragic consequences it could bring. Courtly love literature established a paradigm in which romantic love existed primarily outside of marriage. The ideal courtly lover was typically a knight who devoted himself to a noble lady, usually married to someone else, performing heroic deeds to win her favor and submitting himself to her will. This tradition reflected the reality that aristocratic marriages were rarely based on romantic attachment, creating a cultural space in which extramarital romantic and sexual connections could be idealized, if not openly practiced. For aristocratic women, sexuality was tightly controlled due to concerns about legitimate inheritance. A noblewoman's virginity before marriage and fidelity afterward were essential to ensuring that her children were her husband's legitimate heirs. Consequently, noble families often closely monitored their daughters' behavior, limiting their opportunities for unsupervised interaction with men and arranging marriages at a young age, sometimes as young as 12, the canonical age of consent for girls. Noblemen faced fewer restrictions on their sexual behavior. While church teaching condemned all extramarital sex equally, social attitudes were more tolerant of male infidelity. Many noble households included illegitimate children fathered by the Lord, who might be raised alongside their legitimate half-siblings or placed in monasteries or convents. Some noble bastards rose to positions of considerable influence, though they remained ineligible to inherit their father's titles or lands. The sexual double standard that permitted men greater sexual freedom while restricting women reflected practical concerns about inheritance, as well as deeply ingrained cultural assumptions about male and female sexuality. Men were assumed to have stronger sexual appetites that required outlets beyond marriage, while women's sexuality was viewed as more dangerous and in need of stricter control. For the medieval clergy, sexuality presented unique challenges and contradictions. Beginning in the 11th century, the Church increasingly emphasized clerical celibacy, prohibiting priests from marrying and requiring sexual abstinence from all clergy. However, the implementation of these requirements was uneven and encountered significant resistance. Prior to the 11th century reforms, many priests had wives or long-term female companions. The push for universal clerical celibacy emerged gradually and faced opposition from clergy who saw no contradiction between marriage and priestly duties. As one source notes, it's hard to set a date to when that became an issue. You can find discussions of it in the 11th century and also the 5th and the 9th. And if I looked further, I'm sure I could find a few more centuries. Let's just say that it took hold gradually and didn't win without a fight. Even after celibacy became the official requirement for all clergy, compliance was far from universal. Many priests maintained relationships with female housekeepers or concubines, who were, in practice, wives in all but name. Church authorities periodically attempted to crack down on clerical concubinage, imposing penalties on priests who kept women in their households. But these efforts met with limited success. The prevalence of sexual relationships among supposedly celibate clergy created a contradictory situation in which the very priests responsible for enforcing sexual morality often violated the standards they preached. This contradiction did not escape notice among the laity, contributing to anti-clericalism and criticisms of ecclesiastical hypocrisy. For monks and nuns living in religious communities, the commitment to celibacy was reinforced through physical separation from the opposite sex, regular communal prayer, and supervision by superiors. Nevertheless, sexual transgressions occurred in monasteries and convents as well. Visitation records document cases of monks consorting with women, nuns becoming pregnant, and various other violations of the vow of chastity. The difficulty of maintaining perfect celibacy was acknowledged by spiritual writers, who developed elaborate strategies for combating sexual temptation through prayer, fasting, manual labor, and avoidance of situations that might provoke desire. These writers recognized that celibacy required not just abstention from sexual acts, but also the redirection of sexual energy towards spiritual purposes. The clergy's ambivalent relationship with sexuality influenced their approach to regulating lay sexual behavior. While officially condemning all non-marital sexuality, priests often adopted a more pragmatic approach in the confessional, recognizing the gap between ideals and reality. This pragmatism is reflected in the graduated system of penances for sexual sins, which acknowledged that some transgressions were more serious than others and that perfect adherence to sexual norms was an unrealistic expectation for most people. For the medieval peasantry, who constituted the vast majority of the population, sexuality was shaped more by practical considerations than by theological ideals of courtly conventions. Peasant sexual practices are less well documented than those of the nobility or clergy, as peasants rarely left written records, and what we know comes primarily from court records, church pronouncements, and occasional literary references. Peasant marriages differed from aristocratic unions in several important respects. While noble marriages were typically arranged by families for strategic advantage, peasant marriages more often reflected personal choice, though always within the constraints of economic necessity and community norms. Peasants typically married later than nobles, with most men and women marrying in their 20s rather than their teens. This later marriage age reflected economic realities. Young peasants needed time to accumulate resources to establish an independent household. For peasant families, marriage represented not just the formation of a new household, but also the creation of an economic partnership. Husband and wife worked together to maintain the family farm, with labor divided according to gender, but with significant overlap and cooperation. This economic interdependence likely influenced sexual relationships as well, fostering a more egalitarian dynamic than might be found in aristocratic marriages. Privacy was a luxury few peasants enjoyed. Typical peasant housing consisted of a single room in which the entire family lived, worked, and slept. These cramped conditions meant that sexual activity occurred in the presence of children and other family members, perhaps separated only by darkness or a crude partition. As one historian observes, people didn't have bedrooms. If they had any privacy at all, they didn't have much. Entire families slept in one room, making sex something people were necessarily open about. The lack of privacy may have influenced the timing and manner of sexual encounters. Some scholars suggest that peasant couples might have sought privacy for intimate moments in fields, woods, or other locations away from the crowded household. Churches, ironically, might have served as convenient locations for illicit sexual encounters. One source I found speculates that empty churches might have functioned as the medieval equivalent of the back seat of a car. Two people who weren't married would want a bit of privacy, not because sex was private, but because sin was. Premarital sex appears to have been relatively common among the peasantry, despite church prohibitions. Court records document numerous cases of unmarried couples being fined or punished for sexual relations. In many rural communities, couples engaged to be married might begin sexual relations before the formal wedding ceremony, reflecting a more flexible understanding of when a relationship became binding. Pregnancy often preceded marriage, with the wedding ceremony taking place once the woman's pregnancy became evident. For peasant women, as for their noble counterparts, virginity before marriage was valued, but perhaps less stringently enforced. The economic importance of female labor meant that peasant families could not afford to sequester their daughters or prevent them from interacting with men. This greater freedom of movement created opportunities for unsupervised encounters between young men and women, facilitating premarital sexual activity despite official prohibitions. The Church's elaborate restrictions on when married couples could engage in sexual relations likely had less impact on peasant life than on that of the more closely supervised nobility. Agricultural work followed seasonal rhythms that could not easily accommodate additional restrictions, and the physical demands of peasant labor may have limited sexual activity during periods of intense work, regardless of ecclesiastical prohibitions. Despite the practical constraints and challenges of peasant life, evidence suggests that peasant sexuality was not merely functional, but also included elements of pleasure, emotional attachment, and even romantic love. Folk songs, tales, and festivals celebrated sexual attraction and romantic love, suggesting that these were recognized and valued aspects of peasant life, even if they were not the primary basis for marriage. Medieval conceptions of masculinity were closely tied to sexual prowess and reproductive capacity. A man's ability to father children, particularly sons, was central to his social identity and status. Impotence or infertility could be grounds for annulling a marriage, reflecting the importance placed on male sexual performance. For men, sexual activity was seen as a natural expression of their inherent nature. Medical texts described men as naturally hot and dry, qualities associated with activity, reason, and strength. This humoral understanding of male physiology reinforced the idea that men possessed stronger sexual drives than women and needed regular sexual release to maintain physical and mental health. The link between sexuality and masculinity created a tension for men navigating between religious ideals of sexual restraint and social expectations of virility. This tension was particularly acute for young, unmarried men, who were expected to demonstrate sexual capacity while refraining from fornication. The wild youth phase, common in many medieval communities, provided a liminal space in which young men could engage in sexual boasting, body humor, and occasional transgressions without permanently damaging their reputations. For married men, maintaining sexual control over their wives was considered essential to preserving honor and preventing cuckoldry. Husbands were legally entitled to exercise authority over their wives' bodies and behavior, including using moderate physical force to correct perceived transgressions. A man whose wife committed adultery faced social humiliation, as her infidelity implied his failure to satisfy her sexually or control her behavior. Despite official emphasis on male sexual restraint, medieval culture often celebrated male sexual appetite and conquest. Body tales featuring sexually voracious men circulated widely, and young men frequently engaged in sexual boasting. This cultural ambivalence, condemning excess while celebrating virility, created a complex terrain that men had to navigate in constructing their sexual identities. Medieval attitudes toward female sexuality were fundamentally shaped by the biblical narrative of Eve's role in the fall. As one source explains, the story of the fall, or original sin, set the tone for what was to follow. Women became seductresses, and men the seduced. This interpretation of Eve as temptress had serious repercussions for the image of women in general, by portraying them as a weak, yet at the same time seductive sex. This dual characterization of women as both weak, morally and intellectually, and dangerously seductive informed medieval approaches to female sexuality. Women were viewed as more carnal than men, more driven by bodily desires, and less capable of rational self-control. At the same time, women were expected to be more sexually restrained than men, creating a paradoxical situation in which those supposedly least capable of sexual self-control were held to the highest standards of sexual propriety. The control of female sexuality centered on the preservation of virginity before marriage and the enforcement of fidelity afterward. A woman's virginity was not merely a personal virtue, but a commodity that affected her marriageability and her family's honor. Medical texts offered methods for determining whether a woman was a virgin, including observing a woman's behavior, urine inspection, and sometimes actual intercourse. These same texts sometimes provided techniques for restoring lost virginity, suggesting that deception about sexual history was not uncommon. Once married, women were expected to be sexually available to their husbands while remaining sexually exclusive to them. The marital debt obligated both spouses to provide sexual access upon request, but women's sexual desires were viewed with suspicion. A woman who appeared too eager for sexual relations might be accused of lust or immodesty, while a woman who refused her husband's advances without legitimate cause could be considered in violation of her marital obligations. Despite these restrictions, medieval women were not without sexual agency. Court records, literature, and medical texts all suggest that women pursued sexual pleasure both within and outside of marriage. Women sought remedies for sexual problems, initiated divorce proceedings on grounds of impotence, and sometimes engaged in extramarital affairs despite the severe social and legal consequences of adultery. The double standard that permitted men greater sexual freedom while condemning female sexual transgressions reflected both practical concerns about inheritance and deeply ingrained cultural assumptions about male and female nature. A woman's adultery threatened the legitimacy of her children, and thus the orderly transmission of property, while a man's extramarital activities carried no such implications for inheritance. This practical consideration reinforced and justified broader cultural patterns of gender inequality. While medieval culture primarily organized sexuality around a male-female binary, it also recognized various forms of third gender or non-normative sexuality. These included individuals who did not conform to standard gender roles, those who practiced celibacy, and those engaged in same-sex relationships. Homosexuality, as modern societies understand it, was not a recognized category in medieval thought. Instead, medieval authorities focused on specific sexual acts rather than sexual orientation or identity. The Church condemned male-male sexual acts as unnatural and contrary to divine law, with sodomy, anal intercourse, considered particularly serious. Interestingly, female homosexuality came in for much less criticism than male homosexuality. This may be partly because male homosexuality undermined the prevailing heterosexual concepts of masculinity established in a discourse dominated by men, thus challenging the very heart of society. Despite official condemnation, evidence suggests that same-sex relationships existed throughout the medieval period. Court records document cases of men and women accused of engaging in homosexual acts, while literary texts occasionally reference same-sex desire, albeit often in condemnatory terms. The relative silence surrounding female homosexuality may reflect both lesser concern about sexual acts that did not involve penetration and the generally limited attention paid to female sexuality in male-authored texts. Celibacy represented another alternative to normative heterosexuality. While primarily associated with religious vocations, voluntary celibacy was also practiced by laypeople for various reasons, including spiritual devotion, avoidance of the financial burdens of marriage, or personal preference. Permanent celibacy was more socially acceptable for women than for men, as it aligned with ideals of female chastity and provided an alternative to marriage for women who lacked dowries or preferred independence. Medieval medical texts sometimes discussed individuals whose bodies or behaviors did not conform to binary gender categories. These included intersex persons, those born with ambiguous genitalia, individuals who cross-dressed or assumed the social role of the opposite gender, and those described as having the physical characteristics of one sex but the temperament or desires of the other. Such individuals occupied ambiguous positions in medieval society, sometimes tolerated as curiosities or anomalies, sometimes persecuted as deviants or threats to the natural order. The existence of these various alternatives to normative heterosexuality complicates any simple narrative of medieval sexuality. While the dominant cultural paradigm emphasized procreative sex within marriage, medieval society recognized, if not always accepted, a broader range of sexual and gender expressions than is sometimes acknowledged. Prostitution occupied an ambivalent position in medieval society. While officially condemned by the Church as sinful, it was widely tolerated by secular authorities and even grudgingly accepted by some religious thinkers as a necessary evil that prevented greater sins. As one source explains, the Church's attitude towards prostitution was highly ambivalent. While basically condemning its existence in the highest terms, the Church's stance nevertheless gave rise to yet another dilemma. On the one hand, it wanted to confine sexual relations to within marriage. On the other, it saw repressed male sexuality as a threat to the order of society, believing that it caused young bachelors to turn their attention to unmarried virgins. This pragmatic tolerance led to the regulation rather than prohibition of prostitution in most medieval cities. By the 13th century, many urban centers had established designated areas where prostitution was permitted, often under municipal oversight. These areas, variously called stews, brothels, or bawdy houses, were typically located in specific neighborhoods or streets known for sexual commerce. Municipal regulations governed various aspects of prostitution, including where prostitutes could live and work, what they could wear, and how much they could charge. In some cities, prostitutes were required to wear distinctive clothing or badges to identify their profession. These regulations aimed not to eliminate prostitution, but to contain it within acceptable boundaries and minimize its visibility to respectable society. Despite official disapproval, prostitution was economically integrated into medieval urban life. Brothels generated tax revenue for municipal authorities and provided income for a range of associated trades, from tavern keepers to bath attendants. Public bathhouses often doubled as brothels, offering sexual services alongside bathing facilities. As one source notes, public bathhouses and brothels were often combined. For women, prostitution typically represented an economic strategy rather than a moral failing. Many prostitutes were urban poor, often migrants from rural areas seeking economic opportunities in cities. Others were widows or abandoned wives without family support. While some women may have chosen prostitution from among limited options, others were coerced or trafficked, particularly young girls sold by impoverished families. The Church's response to prostitution evolved over the course of the medieval period. While maintaining that prostitution was sinful, some theologians, including Thomas Aquinas, argued that it was a lesser evil that prevented greater sins like rape or seduction of respectable women. By the later Middle Ages, religious orders dedicated to redeeming or reforming prostitutes had emerged, offering alternative livelihoods to women who wished to leave the profession. Despite the moral stigma attached to prostitution, medieval society directed its censure primarily at the women involved, rather than their male clients. As one source observes, censure was naturally aimed primarily, and if you were paying attention when we discussed the meaning ascribed to the person of Eve, you will know what is coming, at the prostitutes, who were said to seduce these irrational, foolish young men. This gendered double standard reflected broader patterns of blaming women for male sexual behavior, while excusing men as victims of female seduction or their own natural sexual appetites. Beyond marriage and prostitution, medieval society accommodated various forms of non-marital sexual relationships that occupied intermediate positions on the spectrum of acceptability. Concubinage, a stable, long-term sexual relationship without formal marriage, was relatively common, particularly among the clergy and nobility. For the secular elite, concubinage offered a flexible alternative to marriage that did not entail the legal and financial obligations of formal matrimony. A nobleman might maintain a concubine alongside his wife or between marriages, recognizing and supporting any children born of the relationship without granting them full inheritance rights. This arrangement provided companionship and sexual gratification while preserving the integrity of aristocratic property transmission through legitimate heirs. Among the lower classes, informal unions resembling modern cohabitation were not uncommon. Economic constraints often prevented formal marriage, as couples lacked the resources for dowries, wedding celebrations, or independent households. In such cases, couples might begin living together and functioning as husband and wife without formal church blessing or legal recognition. These relationships, sometimes called common law marriages, might eventually be formalized through church ceremony if the couple's economic situation improved. The church's attitude toward concubinage and informal unions was generally negative but pragmatic, while insisting that all sexual relationships should be sanctified through marriage. Ecclesiastical authorities recognized that complete enforcement of this ideal was impossible. The gradual elaboration of marriage law over the medieval period, with its emphasis on consent rather than ceremony, can be seen in part as an attempt to bring informal unions within the regulatory framework of the church. For women, concubinage offered certain advantages over both marriage and prostitution. Unlike wives, concubines were not legally subordinate to their partners and retained control over their property. Unlike prostitutes, they enjoyed relative social respectability and stable relationships. However, concubines also lacked the legal protections afforded to wives, such as claims to support or inheritance, making their position precarious if the relationship ended. Children born to concubines occupied an ambiguous social position. While not fully legitimate, they were not entirely excluded from family recognition or inheritance. Among the nobility, acknowledged illegitimate sons sometimes received education, land grants, or ecclesiastical positions arranged by their fathers. Illegitimate daughters might receive dowries to facilitate respectable marriages or entry into convents. The social and legal status of these children varied widely depending on their father's rank, resources, and willingness to acknowledge them. Sexual violence was a reality of medieval life, though its frequency and social meaning differed significantly from modern understandings. Medieval law recognized rape, raptus, as a serious crime, but legal definitions and enforcement practices often focused more on protecting family honor and property rights than on women's bodily autonomy. Legal definitions of rape varied across regions and periods, but generally required the use of force against an unwilling victim. However, unwillingness was not determined primarily by the woman's testimony, but by evidence of physical resistance, such as torn clothing, bruises, or immediate reporting to authorities. Women who failed to demonstrate sufficient resistance or delayed reporting might find their complaints dismissed or even face accusations of complicity. The social consequences of rape varied according to the status of both victim and perpetrator. Rape of a virgin from a respectable family was considered a more serious offense than rape of a married woman, widow, or woman of questionable reputation. Similarly, a rapist of high social standing might escape serious punishment through payment of compensation or by offering to marry his victim, while a lower status perpetrator might face severe corporal punishment or execution. Marriage between rapist and victim was sometimes presented as a solution to sexual violence, particularly when the victim was a virgin whose marriageability had been compromised by the assault. From a medieval perspective, this arrangement restored the woman's honor and provided her with the economic support of a husband, while ensuring that the man took responsibility for his actions. The fact that this solution compelled the victim to spend her life with her attacker reflects the priority placed on family honor and economic considerations over women's emotional well-being or autonomy. Sexual coercion short of violent rape was even more common and less likely to be prosecuted. Masters might pressure servants into sexual relationships. Lords might exercise droit du seigneur, the purported right to sexual access to female serfs on their wedding nights, and employers might demand sexual favors from female employees. While these abuses of power were not universally accepted or practiced, they occurred with sufficient frequency to appear in court records, literature, and popular complaints against the powerful. Within marriage, the concept of rape did not exist in medieval law. The marital debt obligated both spouses to provide sexual access upon request, effectively eliminating the possibility of legal recourse for forced sex within marriage. Church teaching did recognize that excessive or inappropriate sexual demands by either spouse could constitute the sin of sexual excess, but this moral prohibition had no legal force and depended on voluntary compliance. For the medieval mind, sexual violence was understood primarily as a property crime against the victim's male relatives, father, husband, or guardian, rather than as a violation of the victim herself. This perspective reflected the broader view of women as dependents whose value and honor were linked to their sexual purity and whose protection was the responsibility of their male relatives. The gradual shift toward understanding rape as a crime against the woman herself would not begin until well after the medieval period. How did medieval people learn about sex? Unlike modern societies with formal sex education, medieval sexual knowledge was transmitted primarily through informal channels: observation, conversation, and practical experience. For children growing up in crowded peasant households with minimal privacy, observation provided early exposure to sexual activity. As one historian notes, children slept in the same room as their parents, so they would have heard things, and almost certainly seen things from an early age. This passive exposure was rarely supplemented by explicit instruction about sexuality, as modern concepts of childhood as a protected period of innocence had not yet developed. Among young adults, knowledge about sex often came through conversations with peers or slightly older individuals who had more experience. Young women might receive basic information about marital duties from their mothers or other female relatives before marriage, while young men might learn from older brothers or friends. This informal education often contained a mixture of practical information, moral warnings, and popular misconceptions. For the literate minority, written sources provided another avenue for sexual knowledge. Medical texts discussed reproduction and sexual health, while religious manuals outlined prohibited practices and appropriate marital relations. Literary works, from courtly romances to bawdy fabliaux, depicted various aspects of sexual relationships, though often in idealized or exaggerated forms. Formal education about sex was largely absent from medieval pedagogy. Schools and universities, primarily concerned with preparing boys and young men for ecclesiastical or administrative careers, generally avoided explicit discussion of sexuality beyond moral prohibitions. Female education, typically conducted at home or in convents, similarly emphasized moral instruction rather than practical sexual knowledge. The result of this informal and unsystematic sexual education was a population with varied and uneven knowledge about sexual matters. Basic understanding of procreation was widespread, but knowledge about female pleasure, contraception, or sexual health varied considerably based on individual exposure to knowledgeable sources. Despite the Church's efforts to regulate sexuality, medieval culture produced various forms of erotic and pornographic material. These range from explicitly sexual illustrations in the margins of religious manuscripts to bawdy tales and songs that circulated orally among the general population. Marginalia in religious manuscripts sometimes featured explicit sexual imagery, including depictions of genitalia, sexual acts, and scatological humor. These images appeared alongside sacred texts, creating a jarring juxtaposition of the holy and the profane. Scholars debate the purpose of these explicit marginalia, with some suggesting they served as moral warnings against sin, while others propose they represented a form of subversive humor or a recognition of the carnal aspect of human nature, even within religious contexts. Medieval literature included various genres with explicit sexual content. French fabliaux and Italian novelle often featured sexual encounters described in frank, sometimes graphic detail. These tales typically presented sex as a source of pleasure and humor rather than spiritual danger, offering a counterpoint to religious condemnations of carnal pleasure. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales include several examples of this bawdy tradition, such as The Miller's Tale, with its explicit description of sexual trickery, and The Merchant's Tale, featuring an elderly husband, his young wife, and her lover. Even courtly love literature, ostensibly celebrating idealized romantic attachment, often contained thinly veiled sexual references. The Roman de la Rose, a widely read 13th century French poem, used elaborate garden imagery to describe female anatomy and sexual awakening, while maintaining a veneer of allegorical respectability. Erotic art and artifacts also existed in medieval Europe, though fewer examples have survived compared to textual sources. Phallic amulets, explicitly sexual decorations on everyday objects, and erotic sculptures appeared in various contexts, suggesting that visual representations of sexuality were not uncommon, despite official disapproval. The existence of this erotic material alongside prohibitions against sexual sin illustrates the complex and sometimes contradictory attitudes toward sexuality in medieval culture. Rather than seeing these materials simply as transgressions against religious norms, we might understand them as part of a broader cultural conversation about sexuality that encompassed both moral restraint and carnal pleasure, both spiritual aspiration and bodily desire. Despite the Church's insistence that sexual intercourse should be directed toward procreation, medieval people practiced various forms of contraception and family planning. These practices reflected practical concerns about limited resources, maternal health, and family size, rather than modern notions of reproductive rights or sexual freedom. Medieval medical texts describe numerous contraceptive methods, ranging from ineffective magical practices to more reliable techniques based on empirical observation. Coitus interruptus, withdrawal before ejaculation, was perhaps the most common contraceptive method, requiring no special preparation or materials, but depending entirely on male control and cooperation. Period abstinence based on often inaccurate understandings of the female fertility cycle represented another approach, aligning conveniently with church prohibitions on sex during menstruation and pregnancy. herbal contraceptives and abortifacients were widely used, drawing on knowledge preserved and transmitted primarily by women. Plants like pennyroyal, rue, and savin were known for their emmenagogue, menstruation-inducing properties, and used to prevent or terminate pregnancies. Medical texts like the 11th century Trotula provided recipes for herbal preparations intended to prevent conception or induce abortion, suggesting that such knowledge was not entirely clandestine, despite official disapproval. Mechanical barriers and spermicides also featured in the medieval contraceptive repertoire. Women might insert various substances believed to block or kill sperm, including mixtures of honey, vinegar, and plant materials. Some texts recommended placing wool soaked in various solutions into the vagina before intercourse, creating both a physical and chemical barrier to conception. Prolonged breastfeeding served as an additional, if imperfect, method of spacing births. Medieval understanding recognized that lactation often suppressed ovulation, providing a natural interval between pregnancies. Women who could not or chose not to breastfeed might employ wet nurses not only for convenience, but also to preserve their fertility for more rapid childbearing. The Church officially condemned all contraceptive practices as contrary to the natural purpose of sexual intercourse. Thomas Aquinas classified contraception as a sin against nature, second in gravity only to homosexuality and bestiality among sexual sins. This theological position reflected the view that procreation was the primary purpose of sexuality, and that deliberately separating the unitive and procreative aspects of intercourse violated divine intent. Despite these prohibitions, evidence suggests that contraceptive practices were widespread and that ecclesiastical authorities often adopted a pragmatic approach to enforcement. Penitentials, manuals for confessors, typically assigned relatively light penances for contraceptive use compared to other sexual sins, suggesting a recognition that perfect adherence to procreative sexuality was an unrealistic expectation for most married couples. The practice of contraception in medieval society illustrates the gap between official teaching and lived experience, as well as the agency exercised by individuals, particularly women, in managing their reproductive lives despite theological, legal, and social constraints. Medieval understanding of human reproduction combined empirical observation with philosophical speculation and religious teaching. The prevailing medical theories derived primarily from classical authorities like Galen and Aristotle, whose works were transmitted through Arabic translations and commentaries before reaching European medical schools. The Galenic model proposed that both men and women produced seed similar to semen that combined during intercourse to form a new life. This two-seed theory suggested that women contributed actively to conception rather than serving merely as passive vessels. Some medieval medical texts extended this model to suggest that female orgasm was necessary for conception, as female pleasure was believed to trigger the release of the woman's seed. This theory created an interesting tension with religious teaching that discouraged sexual pleasure, since it implied that procreation, the legitimate purpose of marital sex, required female enjoyment, which was viewed with suspicion. Competing with the Galenic model was the Aristotelian one-seed theory, which held that men provided the active, formative principle in reproduction, while women contributed only matter and nourishment. This theory aligned more closely with religious and cultural assumptions about male activity and female passivity, but contradicted empirical observations about inheritance of traits from both parents. Both models incorporated the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, which dominated medieval medicine. According to humoral theory, men were naturally hot and dry, while women were cold and moist. These qualities explained various aspects of reproductive function. Male heat was thought to cook blood into semen, while female coldness prevented this transformation, resulting instead in menstruation. Medieval embryology described fetal development as a gradual process of increasing complexity and differentiation. Early stages of pregnancy were not clearly distinguished from delayed menstruation, leading to ambiguity about when exactly life began. Various authorities proposed different moments of ensoulment or quickening when the developing fetus received a human soul. Common views placed this moment at 40 days after conception for male fetuses and 80 or 90 days for females, reflecting the assumption that female development proceeded more slowly due to innate coldness. These understandings of reproduction influenced practical approaches to fertility and sterility. When couples failed to conceive, women typically bore the primary blame, reflecting cultural assumptions about female responsibility for reproductive success. Treatments for female infertility included various herbs, fumigations of the vagina with aromatic substances, and dietary recommendations to adjust humoral balance. Male infertility, while acknowledged as possible, received less attention in medical texts and was often attributed to insufficient heat or excessive sexual activity that depleted vital energy. Despite the limitations of medieval reproductive knowledge, medical practitioners developed surprisingly sophisticated understanding of certain aspects of fertility. They recognized the relationship between menstruation and fertility, understood that certain phases of the menstrual cycle were more conducive to conception, and developed various tests to diagnose pregnancy before it became visibly apparent. Bookmark: Sexual Diseases and Treatments. Medieval medicine recognized various diseases and conditions affecting sexual and reproductive health, though understanding of their causes and appropriate treatments was limited by the prevailing humoral theory and lack of knowledge about microbial infection. Sexually transmitted infections existed in medieval Europe, though they were not clearly distinguished from other ailments affecting the genitals. Various conditions causing genital sores, discharge, or inflammation were described in medical texts, with treatments focusing on alleviating symptoms rather than addressing underlying causes. Common remedies included herbal poultices, baths, and ointments applied directly to affected areas. The emergence of syphilis at the end of the medieval period, late 15th century, represented a significant shift in European understanding of sexual disease. The rapid spread and devastating effects of this new illness created heightened awareness of the potential health consequences of sexual activity, particularly with multiple partners. Some historians argue that the syphilis epidemic contributed to changing attitudes toward sexuality in the early modern period, reinforcing concerns about sexual morality and contributing to stricter regulation of prostitution. Beyond infectious diseases, medieval medicine addressed various other sexual and reproductive conditions. Impotence received considerable attention, reflecting its importance for both sexual satisfaction and procreation. Treatments for male sexual dysfunction included dietary recommendations, herbal preparations believed to increase heat or vital energy, and various aphrodisiacs, ranging from moderate wine consumption to exotic substances like ambergris or civet. Female reproductive complaints were also addressed in medical texts. Amenorrhea, absence of menstruation, was treated with emmenagogues, herbs believed to promote menstrual flow. Dysmenorrhea, painful menstruation, might be addressed with warm applications to the abdomen or herbal preparations to ease cramping. Prolapse of the uterus, a common consequence of repeated childbearing, was treated with pessaries, devices inserted into the vagina to support the uterus, or binding the abdomen to to hold organs in place. Childbirth represented a significant health risk for medieval women, with maternal mortality rates estimated at 1 to 2% per birth. Complications during labor were addressed primarily by midwives, whose knowledge derived from practical experience rather than formal medical training. Surgical intervention during difficult births was rare and extremely dangerous, typically attempted only when the mother's life was already considered lost and the goal was to save the child or at least allow for Christian burial. Following childbirth, women faced additional health challenges, including postpartum hemorrhage, infection, and complications from retained placenta. Traditional postpartum care included a period of rest and recovery, special dietary recommendations, and various herbal remedies to promote healing and restore humoral balance. The gendered nature of medieval healthcare meant that women's sexual and reproductive health was primarily addressed by female practitioners, midwives, and wise women, rather than university-trained male physicians. This created a parallel system of healthcare knowledge, with women's experiential learning complementing and sometimes contradicting the text-based learning of male medical authorities. The suppression of traditional female healing knowledge during the witch hunts of the early modern period represented a significant loss of practical information about women's sexual and reproductive health. Adultery, sexual relations between a married person and someone other than their spouse, was condemned by both religious and secular authorities in medieval Europe. However, the severity of punishment and the likelihood of enforcement varied significantly based on gender, social status, and local customs. For women, adultery represented a serious transgression with potentially severe consequences. A woman who committed adultery violated not only religious teaching, but also her husband's sexual rights, and more importantly, the integrity of his lineage. The possibility that adulterous relations might result in pregnancy and the introduction of another man's child into the family posed a fundamental threat to patrilineal inheritance systems. Consequently, female adultery was treated more harshly than male infidelity in both law and practice. Legal punishments for female adultery varied across regions and periods. In some areas, an adulterous wife might be confined to a convent, publicly humiliated, flogged, or even executed in extreme cases. More commonly, she faced divorce, or more precisely, separation a mensa et thoro, from table and bed, loss of her dowry, and social ostracism. A woman's adultery provided legal grounds for her husband to repudiate her, while the reverse was rarely true, unless the husband's behavior was exceptionally flagrant or abusive. Beyond formal legal penalties, husbands sometimes imposed their own punishment on adulterous wives. While church and royal authorities generally condemned violence against wives, they often treated violence prompted by adultery more leniently, recognizing the husband's legitimate anger at such a serious violation of family honor. Some medieval legal codes explicitly reduced penalties for men who killed their wives caught in the act of adultery, though premeditated murder remained punishable regardless of provocation. For men, adultery carried fewer social and legal consequences. A married man who engaged in sexual relations with an unmarried woman committed a sin against his marriage vows, but did not violate another man's sexual rights or threaten the integrity of another family's lineage. Consequently, male adultery was often treated as a minor offense, unless it involved aggravating factors such as rape, incest, or seduction of a virgin. The most serious form of male adultery involved sexual relations with another man's wife, which violated both religious teaching and the husband's exclusive sexual rights. In such cases, the aggrieved husband might seek legal redress against both his wife and her lover. though punishment for the male adulterer typically involved financial compensation rather than physical punishment or imprisonment. The Church's position on adultery emphasized its sinfulness for both men and women, rejecting the double standard prevalent in secular law and social practice. Ecclesiastical courts treated adultery as a serious sin requiring confession, penance, and reconciliation, regardless of the gender of the offender. However, even within religious contexts, women's sexual transgressions often received greater scrutiny and condemnation than men's, reflecting broader cultural assumptions about female sexuality as more dangerous and in need of stricter control. Medieval sexual theology classified various sexual acts as contra naturam, against nature, based on their deviation from procreative penile vaginal intercourse. These unnatural acts included anal and oral sex, even between married couples, homosexual relations, bestiality, and masturbation. Of these, sodomy, a category that encompassed various non-procreative sexual acts, but centered on anal intercourse, received particular attention and condemnation. The term sodomy derived from the biblical story of Sodom and Gomorrah, cities destroyed by God for their wickedness. Medieval interpreters understood this wickedness primarily in sexual terms, specifically as the sin of male-male anal intercourse. However, the category of sodomy expanded over time to include various unnatural sexual acts, creating a somewhat flexible concept that authorities could apply to different behaviors considered particularly transgressive. Theological condemnation of sodomy reached its height in the writings of Thomas Aquinas, who classified it among the most serious sexual sins because it completely divorced sexual activity from its procreative purpose. Aquinas placed sodomy second only to bestiality in his hierarchy of sexual sins, considering it more serious than adultery, fornication, or even rape of a virgin. This theological position influenced both ecclesiastical and secular approaches to non-procreative sexuality throughout the later medieval period. Legal penalties for sodomy varied across regions and periods, but were often severe, reflecting the act's status as both a sin and a crime. By the later Middle Ages, many European legal codes prescribed death, typically by burning or hanging, for those convicted of sodomy. However, actual enforcement of these laws was often inconsistent, with relatively few documented executions compared to the harsh penalties prescribed in legal texts. The prosecution of sodomy typically focused on male-male sexual acts, reflecting both the gendered nature of medieval legal systems and the cultural emphasis on penetration as the defining feature of sexual activity. Female-female sexual activity received less attention from legal authorities, partly because it did not involve penetration by a penis, considered the essential element of real sex, and partly because women's sexuality generally received less legal scrutiny unless it intersected with male interests. When female-female sexual activity was addressed in theological or legal contexts, it was often described in terms of women usurping male prerogatives, particularly through the use of dildos or other penetrative devices. This framing reflected the assumption that all sexual activity must involve penetration, and that the desire to penetrate was inherently masculine, making women who engaged in such behavior guilty not only of sexual sin, but also of violating proper gender roles. Despite severe prohibitions, evidence suggests that non-procreative sexual practices were relatively common in medieval society. Penitential manuals devoted considerable attention to various forms of sodomy, suggesting that confessors regularly encountered such sins in the confessional. Court records document cases of individuals prosecuted for homosexual relations, bestiality, or other unnatural acts, providing glimpses of sexual behaviors that diverged from officially sanctioned norms. The medieval categorization of unnatural sexual acts reflected a worldview in which nature itself possessed moral significance as an expression of divine intent. According to this perspective, the natural purpose of sexuality was procreation within marriage, making any sexual activity divorced from this purpose not merely different but morally wrong. This naturalistic ethics formed the foundation for sexual prohibitions that would influence Western attitudes toward sexuality well beyond the medieval period. Sexual practices and attitudes in Northern Europe, including England, Germany, and Scandinavia, were shaped by a complex interplay of Christian teaching, Germanic legal traditions, and climatic conditions that influenced practical aspects of sexual life. Northern European marriage patterns typically featured later marriage ages compared to Mediterranean regions, with most men and women marrying in their 20s rather than their teens. This later marriage age reflected economic considerations, the need to accumulate resources for establishing an independent household, as well as cultural preferences for more mature partners capable of maintaining a household in challenging northern climates. The European marriage pattern, first identified by historical demographer John Heinel, characterized Northern and Western Europe and included several distinctive features. Relatively late marriage for both sexes, households established at marriage rather than integrated into extended family structures, and a significant proportion of people who never married. This pattern, which emerged during the late medieval period, contributed to lower fertility rates and different family structures compared to Southern Europe and the Islamic world. Northern European sexual regulation incorporated elements of Germanic law alongside Christian teaching. Germanic legal traditions emphasized the importance of family honor and recognized the right of male family members to protect and control female sexuality. The concept of morning gift, Morgengabe, property given by a husband to his wife the morning after the wedding night, originated in Germanic custom and served as acknowledgement of the bride's virginity and entry into marital sexual relations. Climatic conditions in Northern Europe influenced practical aspects of sexual life. Long, cold winters meant that people spent more time indoors in close proximity, often with limited privacy. Clothing was heavier and more complex than in warmer regions, potentially affecting the logistics of sexual encounters. Seasonal patterns of agricultural work influenced the timing of marriages and perhaps sexual activity as well, with many weddings occurring after harvest when food was plentiful and agricultural labor less demanding. Literary sources from Northern Europe, including Norse sagas, Germanic epics, and later medieval romances, present diverse perspectives on sexuality. Norse literature often depicts a relatively matter-of-fact attitude toward sexual relationships, acknowledging female sexual desire and agency while maintaining patriarchal assumptions about male control of female sexuality. Germanic heroic literature emphasizes sexual honor and the catastrophic consequences of its violation, while later courtly literature introduces more complex narratives of desire, restraint, and romantic love. Sexual practices and attitudes in Mediterranean regions, including Italy, southern France, and Spain, reflected the influence of Roman legal traditions, warmer climate, and in some areas, proximity to Islamic cultures with different sexual norms. Mediterranean marriage patterns typically featured earlier marriage ages than Northern Europe, particularly for women. Girls from elite families might marry in their early to mid-teens, while men typically married in their late 20s or early 30s. This age gap between spouses reinforced patriarchal authority within marriage and contributed to different expectations regarding sexual experience and knowledge. The emphasis on female virginity before marriage was particularly strong in Mediterranean cultures, reflected in elaborate rituals surrounding the wedding night and the public display of bloodied sheets as proof of the bride's virginity. Family honor was closely tied to female sexual purity, creating systems of gender segregation and chaperoning designed to prevent unsupervised contact between unmarried women and men. Urban life in Mediterranean cities created distinctive sexual environments. Cities like Venice, Florence, and Barcelona developed regulated prostitution systems that were integrated into urban governance. In Venice, for example, municipal authorities established official brothels and regulated the activities of prostitutes, recognizing the economic importance of sexual commerce while attempting to contain its potential for social disruption. Literary and artistic sources from Mediterranean regions present diverse perspectives on sexuality, from the romantic idealism of Provençal troubadour poetry to the earthy realism of Boccaccio's Decameron. Italian Renaissance art began exploring classical themes that permitted the representation of nudity and erotic subjects within acceptable artistic conventions, creating a space for the expression of sexual themes in elite visual culture. The influence of Islamic cultures was particularly significant in Spain and Sicily, which experienced periods of Islamic rule during the medieval period. Islamic attitudes toward sexuality differed from Christian perspectives in several important respects. Greater acceptance of sexual pleasure within marriage, legal recognition of polygamy, and different approaches to gender segregation. These differences influenced sexual practices in regions of cultural contact and exchange, contributing to regional variations in sexual attitudes and behaviors. Sexual practices and attitudes in Eastern Europe and the Byzantine Empire reflected the influence of Orthodox Christianity, which developed somewhat different approaches to sexuality than the Latin Church of Western Europe. The Byzantine Church maintained a strong emphasis on asceticism and sexual renunciation as spiritual ideals while adopting a relatively pragmatic approach to marital sexuality. Unlike the Western Church, which increasingly restricted the grounds for divorce, Byzantine practice permitted divorce and remarriage under certain circumstances, reflecting a different balance between ideal expectations and practical accommodations. Gender relations in Byzantium combined elements of Roman legal tradition with Christian theology and practical governance considerations. Women enjoyed certain legal rights, including property ownership and the ability to initiate divorce proceedings, while remaining subject to patriarchal authority in family and public life. Female sexuality was controlled through various mechanisms, including gender segregation in public spaces and the confinement of elite women to specific areas of the household. In Eastern European regions influenced by Byzantine culture, such as Russia and Bulgaria, sexual practices reflected a synthesis of Orthodox teaching, Slavic traditions, and practical adaptations to local conditions. The later conversion of these regions to Christianity, generally in the 9th-10th centuries, rather than the 4th-7th centuries for Western Europe, meant that pre-Christian sexual customs persisted longer and more openly than in the West. Russian law codes, such as the 11th century Russkaya Pravda, addressed sexual offenses with penalties that varied based on the social status of both victim and perpetrator. Sexual violence against women was punished primarily as a property crime against male relatives, reflecting similar attitudes to those found in Western Europe. However, certain distinctive features emerged, including specific provisions for offenses against women in religious life and different approaches to concubinage and informal unions. The Mongol conquest of much of Eastern Europe in the 13th century introduced additional influences from Central Asian cultures with different sexual norms and practices. These influences were particularly significant in regions under extended Mongol rule, contributing to regional variations in sexual attitudes and behaviors that would persist beyond the medieval period. As we conclude this exploration of medieval sexuality, several key insights emerge that challenge simplistic characterizations of the period as either prudishly repressive or chaotically licentious. The reality, as we have seen, was far more complex and nuanced. First, medieval attitudes toward sexuality were neither monolithic nor static. Significant variations existed across regions, social classes, and historical periods. What constituted acceptable sexual behavior for a 7th century Frankish peasant differed markedly from the expectations placed on a 14th century Venetian noblewoman or a 10th century Byzantine priest. Even within particular communities, individuals navigated sexual norms differently based on personal circumstances, resources, and inclinations. Second, the gap between official teaching and lived experience was considerable. While the Church articulated an ideal of sexuality confined to procreative marital relations, evidence from court records, literature, and material culture reveals a wider range of sexual practices and relationships. Medieval people, like their modern counterparts, made pragmatic compromises between ideals and realities, finding spaces for sexual expression within and sometimes beyond official boundaries. Third, medieval sexuality was governed by practical considerations as much as by moral or religious principles. Economics shaped marriage patterns, household arrangements, and even prostitution regulations. Public health concerns influenced approaches to bathhouses and brothels. Agricultural cycles affected the timing of weddings and perhaps sexual activity. These practical dimensions of medieval sexuality remind us that sexual behavior is never determined solely by ideology, but always exists within material and social contexts. Fourth, gender profoundly shaped sexual experiences and expectations. The double standard that permitted men greater sexual freedom while restricting women's sexuality reflected both practical concerns about inheritance and deeply ingrained cultural assumptions about male and female nature. Nevertheless, women exercised agency within these constraints, pursuing sexual pleasure, negotiating marital relationships, and sometimes challenging or circumventing restrictive norms. Finally, medieval understandings of sexuality differed fundamentally from modern concepts in ways that make direct comparisons problematic. Categories like homosexuality or heterosexuality as identity markers did not exist in medieval thought, which focused instead on specific acts and their relationship to procreative purpose. The boundary between public and private was configured differently in a world with limited physical privacy. The relationship between sexual desire, romantic love, and marriage followed patterns distinct from modern expectations. By recognizing these complexities, we gain a more nuanced understanding of medieval sexuality, one that neither romanticizes the past nor condemns it as hopelessly backward. Medieval people, like ourselves, sought pleasure, connection, and meaning through sexual relationships, navigating between desire and restraint, between social expectations and personal inclinations. Their solutions to these universal human challenges differed from our own, shaped by different religious beliefs, social structures, and material conditions. But in their fundamental humanity, their capacity for desire, love, jealousy, pleasure, and pain, they remain recognizable across the centuries that separate us. Understanding medieval sexuality in all its complexity helps us recognize that our own sexual norms and practices are similarly shaped by particular historical circumstances, rather than representing universal or natural patterns. This historical perspective invites us to view contemporary sexual attitudes with greater critical awareness, recognizing their contingency and the ways they too reflect specific economic, religious, and social conditions. In this way, exploring the sexual past illuminates not only medieval lives, but also our own sexual present.